to everyone this afternoon at the Institute for Human Sciences. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow here, and I have the pleasure of introducing our third colloquium of the Europe's Futures Fellows, which is a strategic partnership with the Erste Foundation. And we are going to hear two of our fellows. Nicole Koenig will speak first, and then Isabelle Ioannides, who's just had her microphone put on. And we will have consecutive discussions on their two subjects. And then afterwards, as some of you know, we do have a reception downstairs with food and wine. So I hope you will stay with us through both thick and thin, as they say. But first we do our substantive work, and I'd like to introduce Nicole Koenig, who is the Deputy Director of the Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin. She is the author of a book on European security in times of crisis management. And she is also someone who is invited to many capitals in Europe to give her opinions on European policy, its future, and so is someone who is deeply involved in policy thinking and making along with her intellectual work. And she will be talking on a very interesting subject today, and that is the whole issue of sovereignty. As you know, Emmanuel Macron, in his electoral campaign before he became president, has talked about, as many others have, instead of sort of supporting this, what we call sovereignism, a return inside the borders of our countries and being sovereign within our own remits, or taking back control is another word for it. There's this proposition of a European sovereignty and basically the sharing of parts of sovereignty. And so Nicole has been working on this subject, and we will now listen to her. So please welcome Nicole.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you for the kind words. It's my true pleasure to be here as among a group of really interesting and excellent fellows. Thank you very much to the Erste Foundation. And indeed, I'm going to speak in part on sovereignty, strategic sovereignty, but mostly about the future of EU foreign and security policy in times of contestation. And what I would like to do during my fellowship is really two types of contributions. On the one hand, really taking into account the fresh start in Brussels that we're seeing now, to really look how could this fresh start for an EU foreign and security policy be shaped. And on the other hand, to see a little bit what my own country, Germany, could do, to what extent it could play a leading role in this fresh start, a topic that is always quite difficult for Germany, but as the country will face, will have the Council presidency in the second half of next year, it's also rather topical. So first of all, why do we need a fresh start for EU foreign and security policy? And together with Isabelle, I was at a panel discussion last week or 2 weeks ago here in Vienna, and this was actually the opening question. Do we need a fresh start or don't we need a fresh start? And I think there were different opinions on the panel, and I would actually argue that there are several factors that mean that we need this fresh start. First of all, of course, external challenges. If we look at the EU's neighbourhood, we have a lot of conflicts. We have frozen conflicts. We have terrorism. We have the Russian aggression towards the east. So the situation has been in turmoil for a while. And here you see a picture of the Syrian conflict, which has been one of these examples where a conflict has really affected the EU in many, many ways, but the EU did not have the strategic sovereignty or the strategic voice in the whole debate. Then, of course, we have here you see a picture of Mr. Trump at the NATO summit, where there was this air of perhaps seeing a withdrawal of the United States from NATO and generally standing for this transactional approach that the administration has towards NATO. And of course, we also see here the standoff between China and the United States. So we have a geopolitical and geoeconomic competition, and there is a pressing question how the EU should position itself, how it should react to that. Then we also have internal pressures. We have, of course, Brexit, which is now looming, and this will also mean for the EU's foreign and security policy that we will lose one of the few heavyweights, a key defense player, one of the permanent members of the Security Council, a nuclear power, and also an important political driver within the policy. And then finally, why do we need a fresh start now? Of course, it's the sense that we can see a new opportunity in Brussels. We have a very experienced Commission president with a relatively long career in the field of defense, has been a champion of the European Defense Union in the past. And we have a high representative that also brings a lot of experience, both in terms of as a foreign minister and in terms of a former president of the European Parliament. But of course, another factor is why do we need this fresh start, or why do we need a strong common foreign and security policy in the first place? It's always the question of internal demands. And what you see here is the Eurobarometer polls for the past 27 years, where you can see that there has been actually a consistent, strong approval in favor or support for a common foreign policy among the member states, always on average above 60%. And even it's relatively, there is some variation, of course, between the member states, but it's relatively high across the board. Even more interesting, perhaps, is the high support for a common defense and security policy, almost all the time above 70%, and again, even in countries that perhaps could be seen as more Eurosceptic. So this has been stable over the years, but what is relatively new is that there is a rising demand for the EU to play a geopolitical role. And there's this interesting poll by the colleagues from the European Council on Foreign Relations that actually showed that respondents were asked, what if the EU were to fall apart tomorrow, what would be the biggest loss? And it's interesting to see that after the internal market and the euro, the third biggest loss identified by roughly 25 or roughly 1/4 of the respondents would be the existence of a European bloc to counter superpowers like the US and China. So we have a consistent demand for common foreign and security policy, rising demand for a stronger geopolitical role. And at the same poll actually also showed that the trust in the US compared to the trust in the EU is very low. So if you have this question, who do you trust more, the EU or the US, then trust in the US ranges between 3% in countries like Austria and 19% in countries like Poland. So it's relatively low. And roughly 1/4 of respondents also believe that the EU should do more to protect the economic interest vis-a-vis China. So where do we stand now? I think 10 years after the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty, which really promised a stronger, more effective, more visible, more united foreign policy, it's quite interesting to go back to one of the key concepts in the literature on EU foreign policy, and this is this idea of a capabilities expectations gap that Chris Hill coined in '93. So just at the time where the Maastricht Treaty was being ratified. And what he argued is that we have a gap, on the one hand, between these high expectations, high ambitions that are being communicated by the EU, and on the other hand, the real capabilities. And what he meant here was the ability to agree and to decide together, resources and instruments. So you have this gap back then, but what I would argue is that now we have a sort of bigger gap, or even widening gap, because we have, on the one hand, even more ambitious promises that are being issued by EU decision makers and in the member states. So if we think about the promise of strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty, This is one of the promises that is also part of one of the key goals of the EU global strategy. But then we also have this narrative of the EU army. We have now, most recently, this promise by von der Leyen that she will shape a geopolitical commission. So we have a lot of high expectations currently going around. We have also this whole idea of a Europe that protects. And at the same time, the capabilities of the EU are weakened due to both internal contestation and external influence. So I mentioned already Brexit. Of course, this is part of the EU's internal contestation, but is also significantly reducing the EU's potential resources as a global player, not only in defense, but also, of course, in development aid, humanitarian aid, diplomacy, and so forth. And on the other hand, you have more populist and nationalist foreign policies that increasingly prevent the EU from speaking with one voice. We had the example of Venezuela, where there was one member state blocking a common position on this interim President Guaido. We have also other examples where these populist tendencies sort of link up to external influence, and here, of course, there's a key factor is the influence of China, where we had this example where the EU failed to condemn human rights violations of China in the UN Human Rights Council because of supposedly Chinese influence on certain member states that were linked up due to economic interests. So we have this widening gap, and the problem with this gap is that now that we have these high expectations, was also a key issue, foreign policy was also a key issue in the European Parliament elections, in the campaign, and then if we have an EU that repeatedly fails to deliver on these promises, we have a loss of external influence or no external influence because the EU remains silent, and a loss of internal legitimacy because it doesn't deliver on this promise of the EU that protects and projects sovereignty and so on. So the question is how to bridge this gap. And here, classically, Hill has two answers. It's quite logical. On the one hand, you can decrease the expectations, so really lower the ambitions and also communicate that. And on the other hand, you can increase the EU's capabilities. And of course, I mean, I think that on the one hand, it is important to think about managing expectations, and I do think it's a problem to make promises such as an EU army, which is very often misunderstood and where there are a lot of question marks what that could mean. So I do think we have to probably tone down on the narrative, but I think it will also be difficult to go back on certain promises, such as an EU that protects, whatever that may mean, but also a geopolitical commission. So I think there is actually a key point for raising capabilities. And what I would like to do throughout the year is look at three different areas of capabilities. So really look at ideas, institutions, and instruments. And I'll just briefly go through them and show a little bit where I see some key challenges and what could be some areas that I would like to look at for solutions. But it's still kind of early ideas, so I'm not going to present you the finished, finalized solutions. So first of all, on ideas, or what Hill called the ability to decide or to agree. I think one of the key challenges is still the old one, is that we have, of course, divergent norms and divergent interests that guide the foreign policies of the member states. And that links to the question of strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty. If we take that as an example, we have here different interests and norms that influence how the member states think about that. So we have the Atlanticist camp, traditionally led by the UK, but also including Central and Eastern European member states, Netherlands, and also to an extent Sweden, which traditionally is skeptical about this notion of strategic sovereignty or autonomy, mostly strategic autonomy, because it is seen as moving away from the United States and potentially also duplicating with the United States with NATO. Then we have a second camp, which is the more Europeanist camp, which is in favor of this notion of strategic autonomy. It's led by France, but also traditionally includes member states such as Spain or some of the southern member states. And they are actually making this strong case for a real autonomy from the US, including, for example, in crisis management operations in the southern neighborhood. And then you have some member states which are traditionally between these two poles, such as Germany, and that try to sort of balance these two concepts and say, yes, strategic autonomy is important, but only in complementarity with NATO and being more European while staying transatlantic. So this is, but these things may seem a little bit abstract, but they do play an important role when it comes to, for example, thinking about an EU headquarters. And the question is, so we have these divides, and the result is that often either we end up with no EU common voice, or we end up with a kind of lowest common denominator outcome. So the question is possible path out of there. First of all, there's always this question of a strategic concept. So we had the EU Global Strategy of 2016. But many argue that this global strategy is already outdated because obviously it was written before the election of Donald Trump. It still stated that the Iran nuclear deal was one of the key success stories for EU foreign policy. So there are some people saying that we should update the strategy now. But I would rather here think that we need to actually take this strategy as a kind of broad strategic outlook and then really go into the details and look at, for example, different roadmaps for particular geographic areas. So it could be a roadmap for the Balkans to really look a bit beyond at the 5 years, but even maybe at the 10 years. So to look at that and to really spell out and agree on concrete milestones. And I'm saying this because I think that one area where this worked quite well is actually security and defense policy, where you had the global strategy, you had relatively broad aims that the member states agreed on, and then you had a very concrete implementation roadmap that is now really guiding what is happening. A second point in this ability to agree is of course the whole debate, which has also been ongoing for a very long while, on qualified majority voting in common foreign and security policy, because the area is still subject to unanimity. But there have been a lot of proposals that we should move away from unanimity and that there should be perhaps particular issue areas where the member states should agree by qualified majority. And I think here it's what we will see, and I'm sure it's going to be one of the questions that Burrell will have to answer in his hearing, is how can you achieve that? How can you find a pragmatic path forward on this issue where a lot of member states are still extremely reluctant? And here, I guess the question is really which kind of treaty clauses can you use, which are least controversial perhaps, to first make a case, or which issue areas, for example, civilian crisis management, could be a first test case for qualified majority voting, which would actually make the EU's foreign policy more efficient. The second element is institutions, and I think this is an element that links very closly to this idea of a more geopolitical EU, because I think the key challenge is still, 10 years after Lisbon, bringing together the EU's internal and external policies. And I think one of the examples where this plays a role is if the EU wants to shape a strategic approach towards China, it has to combine the foreign and security policy elements that are in the intergovernmental sphere, but also all the economic and trade elements that are traditionally in the supranational sphere located in the Commission. So the question is, how can you bring these together? And here, this is traditionally a role for the EU's High Representative. This is his mandate, bringing together the Commission and the European External Action Service. But what we have seen now with the proposal of von der Leyen is, I think, we have this promise to make the Commission more geopolitical, that every DG should look at the external aspects of internal policies, but at the same time, we have somewhat a downgrading, or at least no upgrade, of the EU's High Representative, because we have 3 vice presidents of the European Commission, executive vice presidents dealing mostly with the Green Deal and digital and economic issues. And then we have the High Representative, which now has a sort of enhanced coordination function, but hasn't been upgraded in terms of his powers. So this is going to be a key issue, and I think one example where you can see that is this idea of the new Directorate General for Defense Industry and Space, which is now placed under under the Vice President for Digital, but which has no direct link to the EU's High Representative. So what could happen here is that you have a divide between the High Representative's part, which is the EU security policy and defense policy, and the part that the Commission is dealing with, which is defense industry. So I have these things could be divided. So this is an important issue, and I think here we have to look at how the High Representative can really make use of this coordination function. He is supposed to bring together the commissioners on external action on a weekly basis now. So the question is, how can he actually make this meeting and these kind of structures work for him? And another issue that is also a very institutional issue is how can bodies and bureaucracies such as the European External Action Service and the European Commission be made to think more strategically. So we now have a commissioner that's responsible for foresight and interinstitutional relations. We have the High Representative, which is also supposed to coordinate. We have a relatively small strategic planning division in the European External Action Service. So the question is, how can these different bodies work together, and how can the strategic muscle of the EU's, in the end, diplomatic service be bolstered? And just briefly on the third dimension, so the EU needs instruments that work, that allow it to act on a global stage. And here in this area, I would like to focus on this idea of the European Defence Union. What we have seen in the past years is that the foundations of this defense union have been set up. We have the European Defense Fund that is supposed to be launched with a new multi-annual financial framework. We have permanent structured cooperation, so deeper cooperation on military and defense projects among the member states. But overall, there has been a relatively strong focus on the capability side. And less on the operational side. And I think in the next year or two, there are two issues that will be quite interesting. And the first one will be the review of the so-called military planning and conduct capability, which is a sort of small nucleus headquarters that at EU level that plans, for the moment is planning non-executive military operations, so military training operations, and that will now be upgraded to also be able to plan and lead executive military operations. And here the question is, how can you really reinforce the added value of the EU? How can you make this institution work, and how can you perhaps have a civil military angle to this institution, which then also underlines its added value vis-a-vis NATO, for example. And then another issue, in terms of instruments, is this question, how can the EU link its different resources? And here we will see a new instrument, which is the European Peace Facility, which is a member state instrument, which should then increase the share of the common costs for military operations. So at the moment, if the EU decides to launch a military operation, there's a share of common costs carried together by the member states, but it's only at like 10 to 15%. And this instrument should raise it to around 35%. So here the question is, on the one hand, will that have an influence on the member states' willingness to actually launch common operations? If they make sense. And the other question is, how will this new instrument, which again will be managed by the member states, will be subject to unanimity in the Council, how can that be linked to all the other financial instruments, the bulk of which are really located in the European Commission? And then just moving on to a very important last ingredient to bridging this gap is the question of leadership, because you can have, of course, all the instruments, you can have all the procedures, but in the end, EU foreign policy also is always revolving around this question of leadership. And I think one of the challenges is that the High Representative has this leading role in implementing the policy, but of course his leadership is constrained because of the unanimity and because of the member states' reluctance to really delegate tasks to him. So in the end, we will still need the leadership by the member states. And here, I think what we will see now is really different leadership constellations. So one important factor here will again be Brexit, because we often had the big three leading on key foreign and security policy issues. And what we will see now is more probably a strong Franco-German angle. So that's why I put the G2. And this is problematic because, of course, not everybody wants to follow that G2. So the question here is how can it be made more inclusive? Then what we will also probably see is more variable geometry. So there's a lot of talk about different constellations of like-minded member states within the EU. So maybe France could lead one constellation, Germany could lead another, depending on interests and issue areas. But obviously these coalitions of the willing will also increasingly be outside of the EU framework, because with Brexit, and we have seen that already, we can also see a lot of intergovernmental constellations, including the UK or perhaps Norway as well. And then finally, there's this question, as always in the EU, the question of multiple speeds. Will we have an avant-garde lead the EU? And here, I think an interesting example was this idea of permanent structured cooperation in the field of defense, where there was this idea that there should be an avant-garde, the willing and the able should cooperate more closely. And in the end, Germany pushed very much for this format to be a very inclusive format. And now we have 25 member states in the so-called avant-garde. And as a sort of counter movement to that, we have an intergovernmental avant-garde led by the French, the European Intervention Initiative, which has kind of similar aims, but is outside the EU framework and includes the UK. So we will have different leadership combinations, constellations, and the question is how can they all work together without seeing complete fragmentation in the area, and in the end, a kind of lack of an EU foreign and security policy. And finally, just to move to the German question and the Germany's eternal leadership dilemma, which doesn't only apply to foreign and security policy, but has some specific elements therein. And overall, I think that we will see rising demand for German leadership on foreign and security policy. And this is, on the one hand, really a consequence of Brexit, because now we will have the big two, and there will be demands on Germany, and not only to lead perhaps together with France, but also to balance perhaps a little bit a French leadership role in this area. And this is also this question of the answer to Macron. I mean, this has been a question that was discussed a lot in Germany. What kind of answer can Germany provide to Macron's visions? And again, I think here there are expectations on the French side to have more German leadership in this area, but there are also expectations from other member states for Germans perhaps to, for example, counter a kind of French drive towards multi-speed Europe in this field. So there will be some high expectations, but I think that Germany faces a dual paradox, and which then explains this dilemma. On the one hand, Germany still has a strange relationship to power. As Hans Kundnani said, Germany tends to be economically assertive, but on the other hand, politically and militarily restrained. And then there's also always a bit of a strange response to German leadership. So Germans are usually criticized if they lead, but they are also criticized if they don't lead. So they're in the framework of the EU context. So if they, for example, if Germany leads on the migration pact with Turkey, then it is criticizing for not consulting enough. But if it doesn't lead, as in security policy, it's also criticized for not doing enough and for not living up to expectations. And I think it's interesting because the reason why Germany faces this dilemmas, obviously there are historical reasons for that, but I think it's also really, if you look at this normative dimension of EU foreign and security policy, you can see that Germany is united on this principle of multilateralism. There's very strong adherence to multilateralism. But it's also united, and by united I mean both on the elite level and on the public opinion level on military restraint. So we have a kind of strange situation that, for example, Germans, there's a large majority of Germans, I think it's over 80%, that is in favor of a common defense policy. But then, of course, if you look at what that means, or even we have even a majority in favor of a common European army, but if you then look at the polls, what they say if Germany still is in favor of the parliamentary approval for interventions, then you also have a very large majority. So for example, yeah, people often say, well, European army, but then it can only do anything if actually the German parliament approves and if the German public approves. So there's still a very strong military restraint. And there's also some ambiguity about political restraint, which Germany in 2014 launched this narrative of international responsibility, that they want to play a bigger role, but you will still see that this is not always the case in every issue area. So we have these internal divisions within Germany and these restraints. So this raises the question, to what extent can Germany actually live up to expectations? To what extent can it contribute to closing this gap that we are seeing in the EU? And I think what I want to look really with a view to the second half of next year is what concretely could Germany do during its council presidency in order to take forward the common foreign and security policy. And for example, one of the issue areas is it has always been in favor of qualified majority voting. So how could it contribute to, for example, the drive of the High Representative to move this issue area forward? Yeah, this was just an overview of what I want to be looking at. Yeah, and I hope it was interesting, and I look forward to your questions, suggestions, and thoughts. Thanks.
Nicole, thank you very much for that really broad and deep insight into the challenges that the European Union is facing. So many questions and thoughts come to mind on this last issue of German leadership. What immediately sprung to my mind was the famous speech by the then Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski in Berlin, when he said, "I never knew I'd say this, but I fear more German inaction than anything else." Of course, time has gone by, and these paradoxes that you so well outlined and that we all as Europeans are looking at in bewilderment. Of course, there's the whole financial issue that you mentioned in passing, the Schwarze Null, and the balanced budget, and the lack of Germany pushing money into the infrastructure, and what will it do to European growth. The forecast of the of OECD is that growth in Europe next year will be 1%, I think, and globally 2.9%. So we're within the midst of huge problems. And to go back to your very beginning, I think it also is linked to the kind of democratic legitimacy of Europe. People have these opinions, but also everything that we've seen in the political dynamic with the rise of tribalism or populism is that people want to feel more included into all of this. Yes, they say what they said in the opinion polls, and you rightly again alluded to the paradox, but when crunch time is there and you have to actually put money where your mouth is, then there are hesitations, and clearly German leadership is key to that future. But I will restrain myself and open the floor to all of your questions, and I see a question back there and up here, so if we can give the microphone to our colleague.
Thank you so much for that. And it sounds like it's not just a super interesting project, and I say this as a political geographer looking at questions of sovereignty, but also one that, as you said, is extremely timely. So I wanted actually to pick up on your last point about legitimacy. That also ties back to one of the first points that you made in the introduction. Because in thinking about, kind of questions of strategic sovereignty or sovereignty in general, it's of course not just a question of who, but also of where. So both of you, you started out, Ivan, by talking about, kind of the seeming division between where the decisions or perception of where the decisions are being made, right? So whether at the national level or at the EU level, and a lot of kind of distrust that has built over that. But also, kind of this question of maybe kind of shifting coalitions around kind of different strategic priorities in different moments. But what I wanted to ask you is if in your kind of investigation of how sovereignty is being thought of, or will be thought of, maybe, kind of projecting into the future, you're also going to be asking about the question of legitimation. So where are the spaces of EU action? Where are the spaces of European responsibility? How should the Commission, the External Action Service, the High Representative kind of legitimize those sorts of interventions and choices as well? So kind of, the extent of that strategic sovereign space.
Mm-hmm. Should I answer
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really tricky and really important question. And I think, again, it probably depends a little bit on the issue area, because as I mentioned, this example of the German approach towards the EU army, which I found that quite striking. That the Chancellor said, yes, we need an EU army, and this has to happen. And then you hear that quite a lot. Now we have a little bit of shift in narrative, saying we need an army of the Europeans because it's a little bit less, it's a bit more vague, perhaps. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that this question, that the legitimacy for these very important questions on the use of force will still remain with the member states. And will still remain with the Bundestag in this particular case. And so it really depends on the issue area, because I think the use of force is a particular issue area where this is also in the treaties. This is one of the areas, defense is one of the areas that is not supposed to come under qualified majority voting, where the legitimacy will always, in the end, remain with the member states. And not in every member state this is a huge issue. I find quite interesting, for example, to compare Germany and France in that regard, where in Germany this is a very, very critical issue, and we have these important hurdles, institutional hurdles. In France, of course, it's much more the area of the president, and you also have a much more permissive public opinion. So this is a very specific area. But then you have also other areas where it becomes more tricky and interesting. So, for example, there has been a push by the European Parliament to have a greater say on the European Defence Fund, which is also could be seen as being subject to its budgetary control powers. But here, again, the legitimacy in this field will come mostly from the member states. The member states will have a strong control over this area, and they will work together with the Commission. And the role of the European Parliament is relatively restricted. So in the end, it depends on the issue area. Of course, in trade is then again a wholly different story. But overall, in these core areas of foreign and security policy, the legitimacy is still going to be derived mostly from the member states. And then the question is, and I think it's a relevant question for which areas could be decided by qualified majority voting. And probably here, you would probably start with something like sanctions or the civilian dimension of CSDP, where it's a little bit less tricky than in other areas.
It was clearly also visible in the crisis of the Straits of Hormuz, where the Americans came and asked for support, and then the Europeans said, well, we can't join something that we do not know how it will end up. But then there was a reluctance of the Europeans themselves to, who will give their ships, their naval battleships, to actually go there and secure what is of vital interest, and that is the oil energy supply for Europe. So again, you see on the one hand, as you so eloquently mentioned, I mean, based on Hill, the gap, this incredible gap between the need for efficient decision making and, on the other hand, the inability to make decisions. And so you rightly mentioned the decision on the Turkey deal. I mean, in desperate times, you need desperate measures, and, you know, forget the intergovernmental decision making, because, you know, 1 million people are coming our way and something needs to be decided. So we're not out of the woods in any regard, but clearly the statement about a geopolitical commission, you know, says something to at least an awareness that things must change. And I think you rightly begin with the idea of a fresh start. But we go here for a question.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Michael Geyer. I'm a new fellow here. And thank you very much for this talk. And I'm glad that you will solve the problems for us. There are lots of problems. And your talk reminded me a bit what Clausewitz calls Trockenschwimmen, you know, trying in the abstract. And I want to bring this down to the concrete a bit. So Germany, we know Germany is a problem, but how strong do you think can Germany become, even within a European army, without the Poles getting very upset? That is, you know, given what kind of force can they actually produce, if they ever would, without the French and the Poles, without shaking the European balance? Second problem, who, apart from the Germans who are not, who in Europe would be willing, and I use a loaded term, would be willing to die for Kiev or Tallinn? Is there anybody? Maybe the Poles? Maybe, well, you tell me. The third one is strategic autonomy. Okay, makes sense to me very much. But what about nuclear deterrence? Should there be a European nuclear deterrence? What do the French say about this? And I mean, I could continue asking you about priorities, the priority of the Mediterranean versus the Central Front versus the North. But my general wish would be if you could bring this down just one level from the kind of institutional and leadership questions that to strategic priorities and strategic possibilities within this Europe today. One last thing, however, which I would want to ask you also, since you're here, what about the United States? How much European autonomy would the United States want us to have? And how much could it digest, and where would it stop? I mean, that is truly a leadership question.
Yes. That's quite a broad, multi-dimensional question. So how strong can Germany become? I think this is a question that Germany likes to ask itself quite a lot, and I think it's often used as one of the issues that, well, if we actually really meet the 2% of military spending, then we will be this overarching military power, and who actually wants that? But I think that the question of German leadership, as you refer to it as well, the demand for it is perhaps a little bit, it's not perhaps so much from the European side meeting the 2%, but it's more about leading also on particular issue areas. And if you think, to make it concrete, about the example of the Libyan crisis, where Germany abstained in the Security Council, whereas its European fellows didn't. And I think this is very concrete. Then there the expectation would have been for Germany at least to vote together with the other EU member states, and then perhaps to play some kind of role in an operation. Then who would be willing to die for Kiev and Tallinn? I mean, I think we already have within NATO the enhanced forward presence, where a lot of member states are actually contributing troops. So I think there is actually a solidarity when it comes to deterring Russian aggression. Of course, in the end, well, if the decision were really to be taken, this would remain to be seen. But there is a willingness to stand up against Russia in the East, I would say, which you can see in this NATO initiative. Strategic. Now, I wanted to mention, where you mentioned European strategic autonomy. To what extent are the United States willing to accept that? And I think that's a very interesting question. And I was listening to the ambassador's speech last week, and I think there has been quite a pushback from the United States in terms of strategic autonomy, in particular when it comes to more autonomy for the European defense market. So we have seen relatively angry letters when it came to the European Defense Fund and this whole idea that this European Defense Fund will be only for member states and that third country entities will not be allowed within it. And so there's immediately this question, well, this is a protectionist measure which is against the United States, is detrimental to the American industry. And this is, I think, where we have most clearly seen the kind of limits of the acceptance for this concept of strategic autonomy. If strategic autonomy means that the Europeans are spending more and perhaps investing around the world / in the United States, then this is not a huge problem. But I think this question of seeing a stronger and more autonomous European defense market is actually has been a key issue.
Yeah, on that issue, you know, one cannot sort of remove oneself when you step 2 steps back and you say, what the hell are we talking about here? I mean, you know, it makes common sense that not every European country, how big or small it is, has an air force, a navy, crack troops, chemical, atomic forces, that there needs to be pooling and sharing, to use the jargon. And obviously Europe, like always, kind of muddles through and slowly moves forwards toward PESCO or the European Intervention Initiative. I saw that Sweden just joined the other day the European Intervention Initiative. So there is an awareness, you know, the common sense finally comes through and they say, come on guys, let's get this act together. And, you know, having lived in Washington for 6 years and having followed this whole debate, there's constantly this thing in the US, but the Europeans now are trying something different, and they want to not destroy NATO, but to make it more feeble. I'm of the view of many Europeans, Ischinger and others, who say, yeah, Europe needs its own defense capacity, which in no way means that this is against the US or against NATO. It's simply having an autonomous pole where if you have a Trump in the White House who says, yeah, well, I'm not going to fight for Montenegro, these crazy people, but maybe Europe will want to do that. I don't think in the real world that Putin wants to touch Tallinn or Kiev. Yes, he touched Crimea, touched quote unquote, invaded a sovereign country, nor will he go into Montenegro. So, you know, we're talking both theoretically but very concretely on a certain number of things. And I think that, again, some things are actually happening. Are they happening too slowly? Yes, definitely. Peter.
For the brilliant summary. And I will have 2 short questions. One is that you also talked about the role of leadership and how important it is that the players themselves are stepping up as let's say, coordinators in this highly chaotic and politically set environment. So what, moving from the institutional level to the personal level, do you have any, let's say, any impression on how Ursula von der Leyen or Josep Borrell or other leaders would really step up in situations? So can we expect some shifts in EU foreign policy based on what we already know from the approach of these people? And the other question would be about enlargement. How realistic do you think the talk previously from Juncker, which who I think set the deadline of about 2025, that's possibly a new enlargement round. Eva Merkel talked a lot about the possibility of enlargement. On the other hand, in key EU member states, including France, there is a rather strong resistance to that. So what do you think are the real, let's say, realistic expectations can be about next round of enlargement?
Well, what do I expect from the new leaders in Brussels? I mean, I think what you could see, Juncker had coined this phrase of the political commission, and now you have von der Leyen coining this term of the geopolitical commission. I think she brings with her this experience as a German defense minister. You could really see how she has been one of the drivers, one of the leading forces behind the activation of permanent structured cooperation. So she clearly has this whole defense union on her mind. So I think this is going to be one of the priorities for her. In terms of Borrell, I think this is now the fourth high representative, the third one after Lisbon. And I think it will be actually an interesting test case because his two predecessors were a little bit less experienced, and he brings with him a lot of experience. So what I could imagine is that he will also put a strong focus on actually trying to mediate between the member states and really trying to bring them together on particular conflicts, whether it's the Libyan conflict, where you have to bring together France and Italy, and to really try to make a little bit this shuttle diplomacy between the member states, because I think this is also necessary. I think one of the questions will really be to what extent will this geopolitical commission and the External Action Service work together. And I know it's a little bit maybe abstract and institutional, but I still think that this is a key question, because this is in the end, if you have all the resources in the European Commission and you have this idea of strategic thinking being in the more intergovernmental side in the External Action Service, then how do you link the two? This is actually going to determine what the added value of the EU can be externally, and that kind of links to the enlargement question, because also here, of course, you need both, and you need this strategic agenda, perhaps linking both the question on enlargement and how realistic it is. I guess there are other people that are, maybe Isabelle knows more how realistic the expectation is. My feeling is also from Berlin that this is an issue that has really come back onto the agenda. That we had the Juncker Commission, where it was clear there will be no enlargement within this term, and now it's very much on the agenda, and the question what to do on the Balkans, and the question what to do about the normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. I think this is very much on the agenda, and then there the question will be to what extent we'll be able to establish a really good working relationship between the EU and the whole enlargement side, maybe France and Germany, in terms of leading the negotiations and bringing all the instruments then together. But yeah, there is a key issue also on the question of public opinion, where obviously there are strong resistances in the member states, and there it will depend on the leaders to actually explain that starting the negotiations is necessary, and that you can probably not yet put a fixed end date to that. So yeah, but I don't know, maybe Isabelle wants to pick up on that question later.
Well, we'll talk more about that during Isabelle's intervention. I have 3 more questions, so I'd like to bundle them, starting with Holly.
Thanks so much. My question is, insofar as you know, for the people that you're talking about, the people in leadership positions in the EU, or for yourself, what are the kind of future nightmare scenarios that people imagine, and what do those nightmare scenarios suggest about what kind of capacity would be required for a common defense or military unit?
Just behind you.
My name is Giovanni Del Re. I'm a EU correspondent for daytime newspaper Avvenire. I have a broader question, if I may, which goes beyond I'm here. Goes beyond the defense. Being based in Brussels, we have the main impression we have is that we are going towards more renationalization of the European Union, and that the national interests are growing instead of being put more in common. I was curious to know whether you also have, from your position, the same impression that we have this kind of problem. For example, the intergovernmental method is taking ground compared to the original méthode communautaire, which was the original one. And that is hampering. You were speaking a gap between what has been promised and has been done is basically, in most of the cases, not the Commission the problem, but the member states who are trying to block. And also in this area of defense, this could be hampering in the end a long-term project. So I was curious to know whether you have in common on this. Thank you.
In fact, I wanted, in a way, to return to the question about Kiev and Tallinn, because you were several times mentioning about the consistently high support for common EU security. But at the same time, I think we can observe that there is no, in a way, consensus on what the threat is and what represents the threat. And neither it is, the lines are both between the nation state, but also within the nation state. Yes, you can take, and it's not only the crisis with Russia, it's migration crisis. Even China, that seems to be not so, not so urgent probably question, but I think it will also not likely to be unilateral. So, and if we return in history to NATO, yes, it's a kind of a success, or in a way, its expansion was based on very clear, in a way, architecture or vision of the world as divided in two. And NATO had hard times after the end of the Cold War. So then, how you can not address, but what are the perspectives of these situations when there is very divided and also interest-based divisions of the vision of the threats, and then also of the ways of the way the EU can be involved.
Nicole, a sub-question on enlargement. Today, Belgrade is covered with facial recognition cameras by Huawei without civilian control, and Chinese police patrols, together with Serbian police, one of the industrial cities in Middle Serbia. How strategic, in the context of contestation, is giving 5 to 10 year framework for enlargement? And will there be any enlargement candidates within this time period left?
Right. Holly, you asked what are future nightmare scenarios. I think it's always obviously a bit hard to predict, but if I think back to the Munich Security Conference, for example, this year, then you had different ones. I mean, you still have this question about, the territorial aggression in the East. This remains for sure a nightmare scenario for many member states. But then you also have a lot of non-state threats. I mean, for example, terrorists that will then maybe return from Syria or Iraq and then maybe acquire or simply use drones for mass attacks. These kind of issues are also, I think, a nightmare scenario, or using 3D printing to maybe construct, I don't know, some sort of explosive bombs or so. This is certainly also an area, and then massive cyber attacks. So what I really want to say is that on the one hand, I think there is really this traditional defense dimension, which is important, and which preparing the EU to spend more jointly through the European Defence Fund, for example. I think this is an important element in terms of really keeping up a deterrence towards the East. But then there's always this whole other dimension, which is actually reinforcing, for example, intelligence and police cooperation in the member states. in order to or even using the joint databases to see whether you can somehow control this return of terrorists from North Africa. And then the whole question of cyber and cyber security and cyber defense, where I think there, again, the Commission has a huge role to play, also perhaps in terms of regulation, and then there has to be more cooperation on that side with NATO, because then you have a lot of civilian measures and a lot of military measures that have to then work together. And I think there's still, to an extent, a gap between the two organizations, or a lack of coordination. You mentioned the renationalization of the EU and perhaps of European defense policies, if I understood correctly. I think it doesn't apply perhaps as much to the area of defense because it's still extremely national and because you still have unanimity in this area. I think what you rather see actually at the moment is that the European Commission is moving into this domain, which can be considered quite a revolution, because the Commission with the European Defence Fund is moving in an area which has been extremely national. And I think there's a lot of skepticism by the member states of seeing a sort of stronger supranational angle, even if it's coming through this area of defense industry. And also the whole debate that you have about qualified majority voting, I think this is not a sign of renationalization. This is a debate that actually goes a little bit in the other direction. But still, what you still have, and this remains one of the obstacles, is sometimes very national foreign policies. I mean, if you think about the UN Migration Compact, this is again more towards foreign policy or external migration policy. Then I think you could clearly see that there was a common position and then it completely broke down. So it depends very much on the issue area. You mentioned the difficulty of having different threat perceptions in the EU. I mean, this is really the key challenge. I mean, how do you explain to somebody maybe in Portugal that he should be interested in security on the eastern flank? But in the end, I think this is the whole process of negotiation of EU security policy, that you actually manage to define some joint priorities, whether it's Ukraine, stabilization of Ukraine, whether it's the Western Balkans, or whether it's Libya, and then actually try to come to a common position. And I think it's a negotiation process, and I think it's unrealistic to expect that it will happen on every dossier. But you can still agree on a few priorities, and I think what you can see is actually that the stability in the neighbourhood is still a key priority, and that's most likely that the member states can still agree on issues there. And how strategic is it to put a 5 to 10 year time frame on enlargement, considering the Chinese influence there? I mean, I think enlargement is a process in the end, and I think probably you can try to push it more. But in the end, it's, I think, also one of the lessons from previous enlargement rounds that you should also not rush it, because if you still have massive rule of law problems or unresolved conflicts, then maybe these should be resolved prior to enlargement. But I clearly see your point, and the question is really how to in the meantime maybe counter this influence. But yeah, I don't have a solution for that. Yeah, I think that was all.
Thank you, Nicole. You've given us very much food for thought, and these are questions we will ponder not only this year, but in the coming years. I'd like to invite Isabelle to come forward. So Isabelle comes to us from Brussels. She is originally from Cyprus. So we have also a Southern European perspective on things, which is very important. That's something that at Europe's Futures Fellowships, we really try to balance in all sorts of ways. The approach, the gender, obviously, and the geographical the geographical space of Europe so that it is represented adequately. Isabelle is a senior associate researcher at the Institute for European Studies and a scholar at the Department of Political Sciences in Vrije University in Brussels. And as mentioned already, she will talk about peacemaking, peace building, especially in light of these last questions that we had in the Western Balkans. Some of us who are from that region are extremely interested. And let me just say, because I cannot resist it, that when Juncker made his famous statement about there will be no enlargement during this commission, well, hello, we all knew that because no country was ready for enlargement. It's not about enlargement, it's about the process, as Nicole rightly stated, and it's about the continuing commitment of the European Union, of the member states, to a process where the normative agenda of democratization and the Copenhagen criteria are essential to bringing in this last piece of what I call core geographical Europe, or the inner courtyard of Europe, as I like to call it, because it's about a much broader issue, the credibility of Europe as a project. So Isabelle, take us away.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Institute for Human Sciences and the Este Foundation for the opportunity to work on for 10 months on this project. So I'm really glad that Nicole spoke before me, because in a way I am zooming in regionally. So it's going to be a little bit more concrete. I'll be talking about the Western Balkans. But at the same time, I'm really zooming out, because I'll be talking about very lofty ideas of EU values. Why the Western Balkans? Well, I've been working on this for more or less 15, 20 years now, but I'm looking at EU peace building there, and maybe many of you are thinking, why EU peace building in the Western Balkans? We've moved on from that phase now today, but it's still an interesting region, because we were involved in 3 phases of stabilization and security building, reconstruction, economic development, and now enlargement, which is more of a transformational role, and that's where the EU values comes in. So it's a project where the EU's normative agenda has been tested the longest, I would say, but also it's a project and a region where the EU's ambition has been the highest. So it's a good case study, I think. And why this project? Well, I think that EU enlargement may have at the beginning had some success, but now we're kind of reaching the limits of its success. And if we look at the democratic governance in these countries, the level of organized crime, the level of freedom of press, the degree to which it has affected the people's lives, everyday life, I think that there is much more that should be happening after more than 20 years involvement of the EU in that region. And the EU has been criticized on many levels for poor performance, favoring order over democracy, double standards, power asymmetries. Why now? Well, I think the discussion we just had has made this clear, and beyond the geopolitical shifts and the internal questions that the EU might be asking itself, Dino very graphically pointed to how other actors are gaining control. So maybe it's a little bit ideological on my behalf, but I would like to see the EU enlargement process finished sooner than later, because I think we're going to lose that region. And because we've made certain promises to that region, so it also is good for the EU to see through its promises, if it wants to be a strategic actor, that is. So my initial premise is that the EU values have been divided from EU strategy. and that the EU's core dilemma has been how to strike a balance between ensuring short-term stability in the region and pressing for conversion with EU norms. So I've defined EU values very broadly, and since I'm at the beginning of my project, I reserve the right to change that as I develop it. But for the specific project of the Western Balkans, I think we can agree that it's not just about the acquis communautaire, so it's not just about conforming and abiding by the EU legal body, but it's also about implementing it and then the transformational part of society. So how do you embed democratic values in the functioning of the institutions that they're actually assimilated within that? Now, very ambitious, because we see it that even in our own member states, some of them, they don't want to embrace those values anymore. So we have a very difficult case to make, but admittedly, at least theoretically, we can accept that EU values are part of universal values, UN universal values, and that the Western Balkans have not been pressurized into agreeing to EU enlargement. This is something that they have willingly got into this process. So normally they should be willingly wanting to transform their societies. These are my hypotheses and premises. Strategy, I would say, is a plan for action. So we're looking at the means to achieve certain objectives that have been designed to achieve this long-term overall aim. And then my basic question is actually to what extent EU values are still pertinent for EU strategy. Can they be changed over time? Are they a temporal issue? Can they change according to country or difficulty or geopolitical circumstance? So can we contextualize values? So they're my big lofty questions, let's say. And if so, what does this mean for EU, the credibility of EU action? So what I'll do today is very briefly, I've looked at what EU values look on paper, and then what they look in practice in the Western Balkans. And then I have a couple of ideas which are really my hypothesis, which I will study during these 10 months of trying to look for a solution to the problem, essentially. So on paper, I mean, of course, we have the EU norms in legal terms, what they look like in the EU treaties, and there clearly the democratic project is embedded. There is talk of peace, there is talk of rule of law. There are articles that justify our intervention in third countries. There's obviously the Copenhagen criteria, but what we see is that, and as some analysts have recently argued, and I'm thinking of Stephen Blockman's papers that he wrote with Daniel Gross from CEPS in Brussels, we've had for the past 5 years what they've called a political European Commission. And now the fear is that we're going to even move from a political commission to a politicized commission. The problem with that is, and the argument of these thinkers is that essentially we're moving from a European Commission that was more bureaucratized and whose aim was to guarantee the implementation of the EU treaties and therefore the EU values, to one that is rather protecting EU interests. And so this is, again, this essence of the divide between EU interests, which can be the EU strategy, let's say, and the EU values. So that we've already seen this shift. This is not something new. However, is this shift becoming bigger, or is there a potential of it becoming more important. Then if we look at the EU policy documents, and the EU global strategy has been mentioned. So if we look at the first one, the 2003 one of Javier Solana, it rather concentrated on risks and security threats. It was called Secure Europe in a Better World. We were obviously in another kind of world, a world that was more at peace, not the contested geopolitical world that we have today, to the one that we have in 2016, which talks about a stronger Europe, where we need a shared vision and common action. And it points already to the internal existential issues that the EU is facing, and to the divisions on the global scene. And I think what's interesting when we compare these two documents is to see how security is framed differently. So in the 2016 document, we make an explicit link between the internal security interests and the external security. This is something that obviously has always existed in EU action, because when you're being strategic, you always have to balance the internal interest with what you do externally. But what was interesting is that now we actually have it on paper. And I'm wondering whether this is giving leeway of doing things differently, allowing in a way for EU values to be there, but to be accommodated. What is also interesting is that when we look at how post-conflict societies are dealt with, we are now shifting the discourse to one about resilient societies more than democratic societies. And resilient societies are societies that are able to deal with an external threat. So in a way, I wonder whether we're not saying that order is very important. Values are okay. Of course, we need to follow democracy, but keeping the order is very important. But I have to say that when we look specifically at the strategies on the Western Balkan, and even in the 2016 EU Global Strategy, when we look specifically on the Western Balkans, this is a geographic area where the discourse has been constant, and we do see democracy, rule of law, human rights, a vibrant civil society, and free press being key elements that need to be respected and promoted. When we look at the EU political discourse, which is the third hand now, and especially in the member states, there as well, I would say that when it comes to the expectations of member states from the region, it has remained constant, that the democratization element is still there more than the resilient element. It has not been lost. And that ultimately, and regardless of the divisions that we may see between and among the member states, I would say that in principle there is still this commitment to EU enlargement and this commitment to democratizing societies. Rule of law, as far as instruments go, EU instruments, has been paradoxically and ironically, I would say, considering what is happening today, put at the center of the EU's action. It was considered as a lesson that was drawn from our EU enlargement to Romania and Bulgaria to put chapters 23, which is on judiciary and fundamental rights, and 24 on justice, freedom, and security as a priority in the enlargement process. So it meant essentially that these two chapters would be opened first, and it would give more time for these domains to be negotiated with the recipient country and for reforms to be pushed. And in order to do that, the European Commission developed a new approach where it wanted to develop high-level strategic dialogue, it said, with each of the countries. So at different phases of 2012, they did open this sort of high-level strategic dialogues with the candidate countries in the Western Balkans, which were supposed to be there was supposed to be consultation with the recipient countries, and the benchmarks would be adapted to the needs of the country at different moments. So your timelines and benchmarking that you suggest is apparently already happening. So if we look at actually how things have worked in practice, I have identified 7 areas where I see a problematic implementation of our EU values. The first one refers to this structured dialogue and its limits, where we've seen actually that, that in practice, organized crime has not gone down. If you look at the statistics, and I get this from local think tankers, there have been 102 organized crime-related murders in the streets of Serbia and Montenegro from 2012 to 2018. Only 5 of these cases have been successfully resolved, and the perpetrators of the 75 other cases remain unknown. Different think tankers, especially in Montenegro, working on the area of rule of law, argue that even though Montenegro is one of the front runners, according to the latest European strategy for Western enlargement, Western Balkan enlargement is one of the front runner countries for the accession process. They are cited as having very weak judiciary, impunity for corrupt officials, weak and politicized institutions, and being hostile to CSOs that actually put forward this sort of statistics. A second problematic area, I would say, is the definition of what we mean European standards in rule of law, because rule of law is kind of a soft area. And I would say that when we deployed our civilian and our military peace support operations in these countries, it wasn't really made very clear what we meant by European standards. And what happened in practice is that we explained things in a very technocratic way. So only the legal prerogatives, and also what international treaties needed to be adopted, but the implementation part remained quite aloof, and it was outsourced to different member states who interpreted the implementation in a different way. And also, I have to say, the Western Balkans was a particular environment where there were different international actors, including the United States, that played a very important role in rule of law, but has a very different kind of model for dealing with rule of law. It's more concentrated on crime fighting. It has different technology. So all of this created a sort of confusion, obviously, on the ground as to what do you mean in practice about rule of law and European standards. A second problem with the European embedding European standards was that a lot of these missions were short-term, 1, 2, 3 years, or even if we look at the missions in Kosovo and in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which ended up being 10 years there, we have to understand that the planning of these missions was always happening in the short term. And when you plan short term, it's very difficult to envision the overall goal and to push for that long-term goal. And in that way, it was very limited. A third issue is that EU support, peace support missions tend to be stuck between this necessity to be coherent and coordinate well, and have work towards your functional priorities. And I think in many ways, we have prioritized coherence and coordination over the functional priorities. And what I mean by this is that a lot of the crisis management missions were deployed at a moment where the EU needed to be seen as doing something. I'm not saying that it didn't do something, but the timing was very important. And also having a certain visibility on the ground was also very important. So it needed to show that it had foot soldiers or police in the area, and it needed to work on activities that give it a certain visibility, also to build a legitimacy with the people. So it concentrated on particular activities. It concentrated on training police. So it was able to say, well, we've organized 15 training sessions with this many police officers from the local area. It did patrolling and monitored and advised, which again was very visible, and it concentrated on certain parts of the police that were visible to the public in the recipient countries as well. So it worked with the traffic police, for example, who are constantly in the street. And leaving other issues which later on it accepted and discovered were very important, which was, for example, linking rule of law with social and economic development of the country, or linking the different parts of the rule of law. So not just doing police reform, but also doing judiciary reform, doing custom reform. These are lessons that came later on and perhaps too late in the process to catch up. A fourth issue is that our EU peace support operations are hostage to political games, and as a result work sometimes to the detriment of EU values. And this is something that we've seen at the level of launching these missions, at the level of the functioning of the missions, and at the level of the closing of the missions. So if we look, for example, at the case of Kosovo and how the EULEX rule of law mission was launched there, one of the problems, obviously, and it's a constant, is the fact that there are 5 non-recognizers, and that there were problems with launching the mission for purely political reasons that had nothing to do with the actual necessities on the ground of moving forward with certain reforms. And we saw that, until the last moment, my own country, Cyprus, was, even though it's a tiny country, was trying to put all of its weight on trying to stop the deployment of this mission. And what does this mean? That the timing, which is very important for a reform to happen, is sometimes compromised. The kind of mandate we create for these missions is also sometimes kind of limited, because it needs to meet the interests of all the member states. And this 22+5 model that we've developed in Kosovo, we also see in the functioning of the mission, where essentially ideas in Brussels stay at this level of 22+5, while people on the ground, obviously, who want to do something, try and accommodate and try and find a way of still pushing the reforms forward. But it remains very difficult, and I think to a large extent, it is a compromise on the EU values project. Then on the closing the missions issue, I think North Macedonia is a very good case, because obviously most of these missions, or all of these missions actually in the Western Balkans, they are hosted. So you need an invitation from the host country to be present in their country. And essentially when the big police mission in the country, Proxima, was there, in 2005, they absolutely wanted to get rid of that mission because they were hoping for accession negotiations to be opened. This EU peace support missions are associated more with the stabilization phase of a country. So they needed to move to another kind of model. The other kind of model that was proposed was a very small European Commission mission, which was supposed to be more a technical support to the police. The problem with this situation, and the EU ultimately caved in, let's say, they closed Proxima and they put the EU PAD, which was more of an advisory mission. And the problem with that scenario was that that was actually a mission that was not doing too badly. It was moving more slowly than expected, but it left at a moment where essentially the reforms were not consolidated. And this is one of the big problems in EU action, that the timing is not always the right one, and that we need to think more long-term. Another point, my fifth point at this moment, is what I've called the price of the sovereignty contestation. So essentially, we ask for political compromise, and the recipient country makes some steps towards meeting EU values, but those steps remain unrewarded. So especially when you look at rule of law reforms, which are quite sensitive, they touch on the sovereignty and internal security development of a country. It implies that you need to sell these reforms also to your people, to your government, to the opposition in parliament. If we look concretely, for example, if we mention North Macedonia, for example, at the moment, because it's in the news and we will have discussions in Council on Macedonia in October, this is a country that managed to change government to a pro-EU reform government, has negotiated an agreement where it made constitutional changes and changed the name of its country, and has made the necessary reforms in the judicial domain. In exchange, it was told it would get the opening of accession negotiations, not EU enlargement, just the opening of accession negotiations. And it didn't in June. Maybe it will in October, we don't know. But I think what EU member states perhaps don't realize is the big compromise that has been made, and the fragility of these governments to remain in power if they're not rewarded for contested changes that they made in their societies. And we've seen a similar situation also with Kosovo, which is waiting for visa liberalization, and which has made the necessary reforms for that. But this is something that definitely compromises the perception of EU value implementation in the recipient country. Help also is tearing down our own credibility on EU enlargement, but hurts also the sustainability of reforms in these countries. Which brings me to the inconsistencies on EU defense of EU values. Another contested issue is where the EU uses its leverage. So it's great to support EU reforms on rule of law, but when this is not happening, it would also be great if the leaders who don't support are not supported by the EU. So, and there is also where we need more coherence in EU action and EU vision, is that when leaders in the Western Balkans run for office and they are not the leaders that support EU reforms, perhaps it would be a good idea that EU leaders from member states do not go and help them in their campaigning. Or if we hear and we know, and the EU Commission reports show that there is corruption in certain governments in certain countries in the Western Balkans, that member states call them out and talk more forcefully. Now, I don't know if perhaps this would be something the High Rep could be doing in the future if member states don't feel that they can do this. Who is the EU person who would be able, in a more objective way and politically would be less dangerous for that person to make such statements, but someone needs to make these statements at EU level. And my last point, as far as implementation goes, is the insufficient support that the EU has given for developing an enabling environment for civil society. So I have to say, the EPA funding, which is the pre-accession funding, has made changes, and it has helped broaden its funding for civil society. So it's no longer just supporting classic CSOs are in the capitals. It's also used subcontracting. It has moved to the regional levels, and it has also learned to make the links between the CSOs across countries. However, there are still restrictions on the basic freedoms and a shrinking space of the core CSO operations, and the European Commission is very much aware that there's burdensome registration procedures. Increasingly now CSOs are involved in protest movements, but there's a growing restriction on that as well. That there are numerous governments that smear campaigns, there's political pressure against the CSOs, and there's also a great development of governmental CSOs, which unfortunately also receive EU funding. And then we have an environment where essentially civil society is still too much dependent on foreign money and EU money. There hasn't been enough of an effort to develop some local philanthropy sector in the region. And one of the biggest difficulties is that the CSO involvement in decision making remains very limited. So now the part where I'll be working on, which is how, and perhaps a little bit ideological, I would say, but since I personally believe that EU norms still should have a place in EU foreign policy. And I would say, think that given the contested global world in which we live, and what's currently happening in the United States, I would say the EU is the one actor left on the global scene where it has a clear normative agenda, which I think makes sense and which we should more forcefully try and promote. So my question is how to ensure the place of EU norms in EU enlargement to the Western Balkans and in EU peace building in general. And I'm looking at two areas, because what has come through in the literature very clearly is that we always talk about local ownership, for example, and the importance of local ownership and how peace becomes more sustainable if we have local ownership. But actually, when we look at how things are done, we see that the people's voice remains unheard or is not put through in the action of the international action of international actors. But I would say that we also need, with the bottom-up approach, a top-down approach. So we also need to buy in the political elites and the leaders, because ultimately these are the actors that we're dealing with. EU funding will always go first through government or through political parties in parliament. So we definitely need to work also top-down. And so the few ideas that I'm working on is on how to develop capacity building to local elites. So how can we bring more, especially seeing how we've developed this relationship with the Western Balkans and how they've moved beyond the stabilization phase to an enlargement phase, how can we bring more symmetry in the relationship? And not constantly for them to have the feeling that it is EU standards, norms, and rules that are imposed onto them, even though, as I said, ultimately they have accepted this process. But every time I speak with them, this is the sentiment that I get, whether it be from civil society or the leaders. So how can we develop maybe leadership skills or a structured dialogue at a parliamentary level? Lobbying skills, or how do we teach them the language we speak that they can use with the EU? And also, how can we boost more meaningful engagement with local elites? So, for example, von der Leyen is going to launch a conference on the future of Europe. If we're serious about this conference on the future of Europe, I think the candidate countries need to be part of it. I'm not sure who we could invite, whether it would be at the parliamentary level or at the ministerial level, or rather technical groups that would be participating at sector level discussion. But if we are serious about EU enlargement, they need to be part of the vision that is being built. Then in a practical manner, perhaps we could include officials on the chapters that have been closed to participate in the council constellations in sectoral areas. I think that could also help push the countries to work harder on closing chapters, because now there's a lot of attention given whenever a chapter is opened with each of the countries of the Western Balkans. But I think more importance needs to be put on the phase where they're closing the chapter, because there is something, a reward waiting for them. And then my other idea is, well, what I'm thinking, how to bring local civil society more into the policy process. So in two ways. First, look at creating better tools. Some of the better tools, I have to say, paradoxically, they have been created and they are being used in the Eastern neighborhood, in Ukraine, in Belarus, for example, and they've been created from the experience of the Western Balkans, but then we've not applied them to the Western Balkans, but applied them to new areas. And perhaps it would be good to apply them in the Western Balkans. So there is an idea of having more funding, first of all, for civil society. Also, if the EU decides to disengage from Turkey, maybe there will be more money for EU enlargement to the Western Balkans, to be seen. Increase subcontracting to try and spread your tentacles to other kinds of NGOs. Work on other issues as well, so not concentrate constantly on security issues, but work more on socioeconomic issues and education, which I think are big issues, immigration, which Alida works on. So diversify the areas of where funding is given. And try and create more links at a regional level, which I think is still not happening enough. So ultimately, a lot of questions. And I hope that what I would like to see at the end of the process is concrete ideas of how we can engage with substance with civil society and political leaders, rather than simply at a kind of formulaic level, and at the level where we count meetings and numbers of participants? How can we move policy together and give this some body to the bones?
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Well, these have been really two very complimentary presentations. One immediate thought, if there's a conference on the future of Europe, we should propose to Ursula von der Leyen to invite all Europe's future fellows to participate and contribute. Just 2 words. I mean, I've been in this business since 2000 of supporting many of these initiatives that you mentioned rightly need to happen. American funders have been just as important as European funders. And secondly, some of us understood that it was all about the long haul, as you rightly said, that one needs to be there for a much longer term, and that short-termism is really, if not counterproductive, then doesn't produce the results that are needed. So I'll open up to questions. Marianne first, Alida second.
Hello, I'm Marianne. I work for Erste Foundation. It was a big pleasure to listen to both of you. My question would be, because you were mentioning integrating civil society better into the political decision-making, how do you evaluate the progress that the Berlin process has made so far, which looks like it's kind of stalling? Because as I understood, the idea of the Civil Society Forum was to do exactly that, bring civil society closer to political elites and start a dialogue. Thank you.
And if you can pass it to Alida, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabelle. This was really interesting. One remark and one question, or actually 2 questions. First one is, do you think this generation of politicians, policymakers in the Western Balkans are ready for everything that you have just described? This future-looking visionary sort of approach? And the second question is, if you could just give us some examples of what you have described as tools being developed in the Western Balkans, but not necessarily applied in the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Okay, back to you, Isabelle.
So the Berlin process. Well, the Berlin process was launched at a moment where the European institutions were not doing very much on enlargement, this critical moment that Ivan mentioned, to keep the momentum. So it's a great initiative, but it shouldn't distract from the main objective, which is EU enlargement. And now EU enlargement is back on the EU agenda. So personally, I would like to see whatever dialogue happen within that framework. Also, I wonder, how much confusion this may create to have these parallel dialogues happening at the same time. I'm not sure that ultimately the Berlin process, civil society forum had concrete results. I certainly haven't seen it. I think the intentions are great. They also consult with other actors as well, but that's the whole point, is to move beyond talking with civil society. Talking to them is amazing, but if you want to build a relationship with a counterpart, you need to have a process where there is a feedback mechanism. It means they give you ideas, you don't take them on, you need to tell them why. Why are you not, create a relationship. This can only be beneficial if you actually have a relationship with your counterpart. If it's just we invite certain CSOs and we ask their ideas, it's amazing, we've consulted the CSO, we read our beautiful report with, you need, if it's going to be meaningful, there are good people in the region who have great ideas, and build a relationship with them. And I'm not saying always the same people, but there needs to be somehow some kind of feedback mechanism. In the EU mission in Kosovo, at some point there was this mechanism of them like inviting civil society, getting ideas. It's also a very young, vibrant society in Kosovo, and they're quite demanding, and they have a very developed civil think tank environment there. And I think to a certain degree the mission there exploited exploited in a good way. I'm thinking in French now because I'm also French, not just Cypriot. Used that resource. In other countries, less, I would say. I think in Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, they could have done a lot more with talking to civil society. Yeah, so mixed results, I would say. Political leaders currently, and whether they can take up the visionary mission of embracing EU values and moving forward on EU enlargement. I would say that it depends on the country and it depends on the leaders. And I think there are visionary people in every country that we could work with. I found very inspiring the meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago with a representative also that included a representative from the Liberal Party of Austria that talks to liberal parties in the countries and tries also to create a regional network, because it's not enough just to be talking individually to the countries, but you need to create connections among the countries and introduce them to actors with whom they could work. Yes, I'm an optimist, I guess. I want this to work, so I have to believe that there are people out there who want to work on this. Also, I find that there's a lot of turnover in the Western Balkan societies, of people moving from civil society to the political domain and bringing fresh ideas. There's more potential, well, although now even in Western Europe we've seen the trend changing somehow, but there's a lot more young blood coming into the political domain, I think, than traditional societies. So there is potential for change.
And tools?
The tools, I would say that in the Eastern Partnership country, they have been better at sanctioning government, but helping civil society and making sure that money goes to civil society. There's also the European Endowment for Democracy has been used more thoroughly for Eastern Partnership countries. They've also been better at supporting protests movements, for example, and sub-granting has been more developed there. So I think these are things that there are lessons that were drawn from the Western Balkans that could come back to the Western Balkans.
Yeah, thank you very much, Isabelle. Really interesting talk. I wanted to ask you on this point that you made, that maybe if chapters are closed, then maybe the candidates could be invited to the council. And I'm just wondering to what extent this was actually realistic. I know that there are some formations where the candidates are joining, but I also know that generally the EU is quite restrictive on inviting non-EU members to the council. So just perhaps you could elaborate a bit on that. And then I would just like to put Dino's question again to you about what could the EU do on countering Chinese influence that maybe is not totally in line with EU values in the region.
Well, my idea would be to, and actually I think there is an interest at EU level at the moment to do this if they manage to close chapters. If you close a chapter, it means you've met the acquis communautaire in a certain area. If you're working on the logic that the ultimate enlargement perspective is long-term, which it is long-term, and I think everyone knows it's long-term. I think even the recipient countries know it's long-term, they just don't know they just don't perceive it as being as long-term as the Europeans. Then you need to find a solution, like a mid-term, long solution where you accommodate their interests and keep the hope and keep the process going. And at the level of technical groups, I would say you could invite them, I would say, more than observers, or else it won't be interesting for them, possibly not with voting rights, however, but engage them in a discussion. But they would need to receive, I think, a meaningful role beyond observation. I need to think about it further. Any ideas are welcome, by the way. And on China, yes, it's true. I mean, both are seen as countries compromising the EU value-ridden project of the EU, but the countries are free to choose their partners, so it's also up to us to make our product more, more desirable. You cannot stop them from accepting money from China because they're not member states yet, right? This is something, for example, EU member states could suggest and persuade Cyprus to do when Cyprus was in an economic crisis, not to accept a loan from China, but Cyprus could see the value of that. Everything is about bargaining, and our bargaining position is not very good today. So we need to make our products more interesting.
Just two brief points before I give Peter the floor. One is that, in times of crisis, the Western Balkans were at the table in Brussels or Berlin, and that was the migration crisis, because you couldn't solve the migration crisis without having the countries of the Balkan route deciding with you or being part of the solution. So, everything is possible where there's a will, there's a way. But I think in the way that you describe it is I think something that a lot of us have been urging for many years. Bring us to the table whenever is possible without giving voting rights, but participating in a learning process. And on China, China bought the biggest Greek port in Piraeus. They bought Volvo and Saab in Sweden. They bought 10% of Daimler-Benz for $10 billion. So, it's a mixed picture. And yes, absolutely a crucial question for us, but it's part of a bigger picture. And as you've probably seen, the German presidency is foreseeing a bilateral between the 27 or 28 European member states and China during its presidency. So again, slowly, but putting its act together. And I think that there are ways in which this can be countered if there's the geopolitical understanding. And that's why, just to add to what you said, the Commission strategy on the Balkans that was published last February in 2018 was exactly a response to Russian, Chinese, Gulf state, and Turkish action in the region. Peter.
Thank you very much. Two short questions. One on the public opinion in the Western Balkans countries on the EU accession, because if I remember well, when I took a look at the figures about the support of EU in the Western Balkans, in some countries such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, we could see rather a declining and not necessarily a rising trend. I think a kind of accession fatigue, which is, let's say, the other side of the enlargement fatigue. Probably the EU is not in its best shape to project its values, and it's not as attractive as it used to be, let's say, 10 years ago, and also a frustration over, let's say, not receiving too much promises on the accession. So what do you think about that? And the other would be a very specific one. There is a highly controversial candidate put forward by Ursula von der Leyen, Laszlo Trócsay, the Hungarian one, for the enlargement portfolio. But my question would be how much it really matters who is the commissioner personally responsible for enlargement.
Okay. I'll start with the second one. I think it matters a lot. It matters a lot. The image we project is extremely important. The image we project also to our own member states. If we tell them that rule of law isn't so important at the end of the day. I mean, I don't know I don't think this was done on purpose to project that message. But unfortunately, ultimately, that's the message that people saw. I think there were obviously different interests for balancing who would get what portfolio. Obviously, I'm sure you saw the statement by the Visegrad group that clearly came out saying we are pro-enlargement and we will support rule of law and democracy in the region. That's great, but again, I'm wondering whether we have this divide between what happens on paper and what happens in action. But the message we give is not the right message if, you know, we propose a commissioner that did not support rule of law in his own country when he was Minister of Justice, and we give the portfolio to a country that is harboring Gruevski. I don't think the message is great. Enlargement fatigue. Yes, there is enlargement fatigue. The one element that I didn't tackle in my presentation because I still don't know how to deal with it, which a bit relates to what Alida said, is the responsibility on the Western Balkan side as to why things are not progressing. Because I've talked about the limits in what the EU is doing, but there's also limits from the recipient side. And, you know, there's also the issue of when does the responsibility become shared, at which point of the process, you know, local leaders, national leaders in the recipient countries should also take responsibility for things not moving forward. But still, we need to find the partners that are willing to push our agenda forward, and we need to be perhaps a little bit more American about this, not be afraid to do it. Because our project, I think, is legitimate. Why not push universal values forward? What is wrong with that?
I like that.
Yes, I've been struggling and debating issues of civil society with my colleague in Soviet history, Sheila Fitzpatrick, for many, many years. And we could never agree on anything except that we both thought we knew what civil society is. Now, lately, I've come to really question what actually this might be, what civil society might be today, and what it, I mean, given the novelty of a mediatization of society, given the transformation of property structures, the new inequality, there's a whole long list. But I'm simply put, you know, what is it that you want the EU to foster when you say that the EU should foster civil society in the Western Balkans? Is this the kind of traditional 19th century, early 20th century, you know, property owning, associations, public culture type of civil society, or perhaps with the European twist? A cosmopolitan twist is always part of it, right? But, or is it something new, given that society has changed and that the creation of social bonds, to speak with Hannah Arendt, has dramatically changed over the last 30, 40 years?
Yes. Well, the EU will never do postmodern civil society development, but at the moment it's doing very, very traditional civil society development, I think. If already it could find ways to link up different sectors of civil society, engage in meaningful dialogue with them, create long-term sustainable relationships, try and create a widespread network where it doesn't work in silos with different actors, but it tries to bring the different actors together. So if it's talking to opposition groups or business groups or emerging leaders, which could also be non-traditional civil society, let's say, traditional civil society in the capitals, outside the capitals, try and bring those actors and make them talk to each other as well. This already would be an improvement, but I don't think they will be doing postmodern civil society development. I mean, we're still talking about a classic donor, and a lot of what I say is not only a limitation of the EU, I should say. It's a limitation of any big international organization. I don't think, if I was looking at the UN, I'm sure I would come up with the same conclusions, possibly worse, because it's an even bigger organization. There's more commonality among the EU member states, and I think there is still a degree of coherence and coordination in what we do. I think there's also ambition, but when you're talking about 27 member states coming together to do something, there's clear limitations. So yes, I have an ambitious project, but I want to remain a pragmatist as well, because I mean, I live in Brussels and I've worked with the institutions, I still do, and I know there are limits to what can be done, but I'm sure we can push the envelope further.
Yeah, thanks so much. I get a little nervous when I hear about like pushing American values and universalism, especially with respect to the Western Balkans, particularly because of the blowback that it produces. It just doesn't work, or at least historically, I think that model has produced a lot of resistance, you know, and some of it quite legitimate. And I'm wondering if, like, I don't know if there are any European states that have joined the European Union because of its universalist values. I think there were different ways in which people could imagine them, you know, like peoples could imagine themselves within a European configuration that corresponded to a lot of their own visions. Like if I think of Hungary, I think, you know, the European Union in some respects represented the realization of its territorial kind of sense that all Hungarians should be united in a single state. And now they kind of are. And what if, you know, one of the old ambitions in this region is Balkan Federation. And I know that's a weird thing to be mentioning now of all times, but what about thinking of, you know, going back to Europe of regions and thinking about what are the ambitions that this region has had historically, that it continue, that have lingering appeal, that says, you know, hey, this is something that has been talked about over and over again in the past. It's been executed badly, or, you know, like in the past, but that it still continues to have this residual appeal. We are something different. We are something special. We have something in common. And, you know, like, what about thinking of, in terms of the appeal of Balkan Federation, you know, the one that was frustrated when, you know, Dimitrov and Tito couldn't make a bilateral agreement or whatever, but some version that says this is the realization of your regional aspirations, not just the realization of our universalist values.
Yes. This is why I said at the beginning that I'm also thinking about whether values are context specific and temporal. Can we think about shifting values, or should we problematize different levels of democratization? We're not all democratic at the same level or equally developed. I'm not saying that they engaged into this process because they were for EU values, but EU values is the big requirement for them to be part of this family, and they know it is. I think ultimately, of course, there's resistance, but I think that we could also say that there's parts of the population that do want these values, see the merit in these values. But I think
it's not about coming up with something counter to these values. It's about coming up with something that has much broader appeal to people actually on the ground.
I think we could come up with something that has much more appeal if we actually listened to what they said and made them think about what they actually want. So rather than also them presenting themselves as, you know, in opposition to what other actors can offer other than the EU, but we have China that can offer this to us, or we have Russia that can offer this to us, and try and put international players against each other for them to come up with a coherent argument of why they have an added value in the EU family, which I think they do, but they need to articulate it better, even if it's an argument that's not EU value based. I think they also need to think more about how they see the future within the EU. This concept of a borderless EU, anyway, the idea already is there that once they are within the European Union, it won't matter so much. They will have a sort of regionalism. We are a regional space anyway. Nicole thinks more about these questions. Maybe he can say something about it. But this is also the argument that is sold to the Cypriots. Fix it, because anyway the two bits of the country will be in the EU, and it doesn't really matter anymore where the border is. But then it's up to the people to embrace this, and are they embracing this idea of the Yugoslav regionalism?
I don't think Yugoslav, I wouldn't use that word, but Balkan Federation, I think, continues to be a kind of dream.
Related to your question, to your approach, at what level of aggregation, regional or local aggregation, do you get equality benefits? That is, in an unequal Europe of very small, and some very powerful but still medium-sized actors, how do you create the symmetry that you would that you see as one of the goals? And one of the classic solutions, the 20th century solutions that never came about but still are attractive, is regional confederations rather than an all-European federation, because everybody, at least in the 20th century, thought, and some people think today, that an all-European confederation must be hegemonic in one way or the other. So regional federation would equalize the territory, as it were. I think that's the way I would interpret. That's the way I would interpret turn the question.
One final comment briefly, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I would also touch the question of civil society, because in some sense, to put it absolutely shortly, is not the rise of populism the very reaction against fostering of civil society? So to see in the rise of populism the case study in the post-communist country, in the Balkan countries, that it is the very concept of civil society in some way obsolete, and that we should think beyond civil society in order to deal with the problem of right-wing populism and so on. So maybe this is the question that Mr. asked, that what does it mean exactly, the civil society, if it is not some kind of Cold War thinking, that we should democratize the state from within, but the states we have in Europe today is quite weak, and when we promote and foster civil society from within, from the bottom, the states reaction is actually that they feel betrayed, or they feel that it is some kind of undermining the state's sovereignty. So the populist reaction could be the answer to the Western fostering of civil society. So to think beyond this concept, I think it is needed in some sense.
Final thoughts, Isabelle.
Okay. The problem that you laid out is one that member states struggle all the time. This is why I think qualified voting majorities is not going to happen, and certainly not in foreign policy, because the small member states and the neutral member states on defense issues are never going to accept something like that. Having a vote around the table is the one thing that makes them seem equal, even though we all know that they're not. They're equals, and there are less equals on that table of equals. Of course, then there's always this alliance building, but one man, one vote is always going to be very important around that table. And yeah, I mean, the dynamics within Europe are already difficult. Are we talking about the EU 15 versus the others, or regional coalitions, or the South, and the North, the East, the West, or the Western Europe and the post-communist countries? I mean, these issues are things that come up every day in the decision-making process of the EU. So I don't expect it to get any easier when the Balkans come in. But if they vote like they vote at the Eurovision Song Contest, they should be fine.
12 points pour Isabelle. The information that I'm getting from various sources ahead of the council meeting in October, that there seems to be agreement slowly coming together that both North Macedonia and Albania would get a negotiation date, which would prove that there is serious geopolitical thinking and not only thoughts of compensation, to keep the dynamic, the process, because as we know, the opening of negotiations in enlargement terms doesn't mean anything, because all these countries are at least 8 years or 9 years away from possible completion of the negotiation process. The second one, and this goes to the leaders, to Alida's questions, which is very pertinent, because in fact 90% of the work needs to be done at home, and the little help from our friends is of course important, but unless we have the energy from inside, nothing will happen. And that is that there is thinking of going towards a regional common market and loosening of borders. That's where these leaders, whatever we think of them, is that enlargement, the date of entry is far away, and that things need to happen, which also means that they understand that they need to prove to Brussels, to speak simply, that they are serious about the values. And it's not about universalism, Holly, or imposing anything. It's about the coming of these two things together. First of all, the peace project. We shouldn't have had war in the Balkans at the end of the 90s. And secondly, what people want, I like to say, because if we had a referendum in any of these countries on Sunday, we would have clear majorities to enter the European Union. Why? Because they know there's a little more certainty, there's a little more predictability, and a little more prosperity if you're inside the club. I love quoting Foreign Minister of North Macedonia, Nikola Dimitrov, in Holland in one of these debates, when asked, why do you want to join this thing? Look, it's sort of falling apart. For the doom and gloom, he said, you don't know what it is to be outside. So, thank you, Isabelle, and join us for the